Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. So in this video, I want to talk about Mercury square or opposite Jupiter in the birth chart. And I have made a video on the conjunction before, so if you're interested in that one, I can link it in the cards for you. All Mercury-Jupiter aspects do have some similarities to them, whether they're the easy or the hard aspects. Mercury and Jupiter aspects are interesting because when they're square or opposite in a birth chart, they're showing the natural conflict that already exists between Mercury and Jupiter because they are already naturally square and opposite to each other in the zodiac wheel. So the conflict itself isn't complex to understand because Mercury and Jupiter are always indicating the dynamic between how we process information and how we think and how we learn and how that comes to form broader Jupiter perspectives. So they're always having that kind of relationship with one another, but that relationship by nature is conflicted because they are processing information in different ways or in different areas of life. Or they're focused on different things. In themselves, they're not terribly consequential and they're not necessarily like complicated aspects, but if they're mixed with other hard aspects, then that's when we can see more issues with Mercury and Jupiter hard aspects, the square and the opposition especially. For instance, if other hard aspects are already showing morality or ego issues or issues with discernment or existential fears or anxiety or even grandiosity, like grandiose thinking, grandiose beliefs, Mercury-Jupiter aspects mixed in with that can create a complex that then can exasperate those issues or exasperate the thinking surrounding those issues. It's important to just look at them with everything else, just like any other aspect. So there are some similarities between the square and the opposition. These people actually can be really funny. You see Mercury-Jupiter aspects a lot in comedians because it gives a performance factor to their speech and to their communication. So they're great storytellers, especially with the opposition. They also love to learn and they really enjoy teaching other people about what they've learned and just the kind of views that they come up with, the kind of perspectives that they have, and just the knowledge that they gain. They love to teach people about that, especially with the square. And at their best, they can develop insights into new ways of looking at or solving abstract problems. They can really fill in the gaps in our knowledge with what they learn and their perspectives on things. Another similarity between them is that, and this can be seen in all Mercury-Jupiter aspects, but especially with like the conjunction, the square, and the opposition, and the inconjunction, the search for truth can feel endless to these people. Finding the meaning of life can be almost like a mental mission for them. But this quest for the meaning of life or to find answers to their questions, it can be more frustrating for people with the square and the opposition because the square and the opposition makes the mind more restless, so their mind will never feel settled on an answer. People who have the square and the opposition between Mercury and Jupiter, they have to accept that the more that they learn, the less they actually know. And once they can accept this, that's when they can actually probably do better with these aspects. Because this actually will allow for their mind to remain open instead of becoming too dogmatic in their views, which can happen with the hard aspects. Maintaining an open mind is one of their goals. It is one of their best attributes, but it can just feel hard for them to achieve that because they're so keen on finding answers that once they feel like they do, they might stick with those answers because the idea of there still being more can produce that mental unease. But at their best, their knowledge can help them develop a great wisdom that they can share with others. And if they work on keeping their mind open, then they can continue to be teachable, which means that they will be more willing to learn from others and to continue learning throughout their lives. Other similarities are that they can have a hard time focusing on everyday tasks or have a hard time maintaining routines because Jupiter is very broad-minded, so it's hard for them to focus on like the mundane mercurial side of life, the everyday things. They also love to talk about and learn about Jupiter things like philosophy or religion, sometimes even politics, because Jupiter can rule your ideologies, other cultures, travel, things like that. So those are some similarities between the square and the opposition. Now I want to talk about each of them individually. So I want to start off with the square. So the square shows that there's a tension between how someone, again, processes information and learns, and then how they're going to transition that, the steps that they're going to take to transition that into a broader perspective, their broader outlook on the purpose of life. How they're going to formulate that into a more comprehensive framework of what they believe in. I've seen some themes with the square. Of course, this isn't how the square is always going to be. Like, aspects can show up many different ways. I've noticed two main themes. One of them is that they can be a little bit more narrow-minded, even though they will seem or come across as if they are very broad-minded. They'll take like large ideas or perspectives, like very broad perspectives, and they'll mold them together into one outlook, one framework of how they view things, how they view life. And it seems solid, but it's actually sometimes missing key pieces of information, or it's overlooking important details. But they can become kind of set on this perspective, and they can be very insistent on teaching this as if it applies to everyone, or as if it should or could apply to everyone, like this kind of moral outlook or belief system. But again, it doesn't, because it's missing those key pieces of information, because again, they still have more to learn with Mercury-Jupiter aspects. There's always more to learn. In a way, what they're doing is kind of imposing a specific perspective onto life, like their own idea of something. But doing that can make their outlook too rigid. Another way that I've seen this show up is that they can be very scatterbrained, but almost to the point where they can be mentally ungrounded, meaning that they'll be so open that they'll just accept anything, like anything as the truth. So this is where we see more issues of discernment, especially if there's other hard aspects that indicate a personality that is very open. You know, that is one of the positive things about the square. But if there's already other things going on in the chart that show that they might be a little bit gullible or maybe even naive, and I don't mean that in a mean way, I just mean that they would be less prone to really try to look at the details, like really try to be skeptical. So it can just kind of exasperate that kind of overly optimistic outlook, or maybe belief in a certain perspective of life that might not actually be true. Regardless of how the square shows up, these people, I've noticed that they tend to be kind of aloof or somewhat detached or disconnected, especially if they're still like operating from a place of being mentally like searching all the time. If they still haven't accepted that they're never going to reach that finish line with what they learn, then I've noticed that these people can be more disconnected and even disorganized. It's interesting because when they are challenged, that's when they have to really think about their ideas, and because their perspective can kind of fall apart once they are challenged, or you can kind of see the holes in their ideas. So that's why, even though they might not like it, because I mean, let's face it, nobody really likes to be challenged all the time. Even though they might not like it, it's actually important for them to be challenged and to continue challenging themselves too, to just make sure that they're getting all the facts straight or collecting as much information as they can before they come up with like a definitive conclusion on something, because sometimes they might just rush to that conclusion before they've really taken the time to analyze the information first. Because again, there's a conflict between the way Mercury operates, which is that analysis, which is the details of the Jupiter perspective, and then Jupiter that just wants to blow through those mental barriers and that like rigid way of processing information. So that the square is just showing that conflict between those two ways of learning is always calling for the individual to adjust their way of thinking, their way of learning. And if they don't take time to really analyze information, it can get to a point where they might just end up following someone else's ideas and thinking that they're following their own without really reflecting on whether or not those ideas actually resonate with them. So that's a little bit about the square. So now I want to talk about the opposition. This is where we see more of the performance factor in Mercury-Jupiter aspects. The people who have the opposition tend to be more of the comedians. What's interesting is that these individuals, especially, you can see this with all Mercury-Jupiter aspects, but especially with the opposition, they can be pretty blunt. And with the opposition, they can be people that come across as if you shouldn't challenge them. And sometimes they can kind of get away with saying things very bluntly, especially if they say it in like a funny way, but it depends on, I guess, their audience or their delivery, because humor is very dependent on culture. Usually though, you see this in people who just like to exaggerate a lot. Exaggerate their stories or their own version of the truth. Sometimes the opposition can show up in people who are kind of deceptive, like, or maybe they don't necessarily flat out lie, but they also won't tell you the truth. Or again, they will exaggerate it, or they'll just kind of override the truth, or just kind of skip over it because it's part of the details that their Mercury overlooks. And just like other Mercury-Jupiter aspects, but especially with the opposition, this one can really exasperate other hard aspects that they might have in the chart. And the Mercury-Jupiter opposition can actually end up reinforcing those perspectives, even though they're not healthy, or maybe they might be affecting their relationships and how they treat other people. Whereas the square might not really look too closely at their beliefs and whether or not they're truly their own beliefs. The opposition, I've noticed, they want to be more of the leaders with their beliefs. So they won't necessarily follow somebody else's perspectives. They will want other people to follow theirs more. But again, just like with the square, they might overlook important details of how it can actually be applied to other people. Mercury-Jupiter aspects can show some hypocrisy. Granted, everybody's a hypocrite in some way in their lives, but Mercury-Jupiter aspects can exasperate that in an individual if they're not being honest with themselves, if they're not being honest about what they believe, and if they continue to overlook important information, even if it contradicts their current perspectives, their current beliefs. So again, people with the square in the opposition, they're grappling with those bigger philosophical questions. One of their greatest missions in life is to find the truth and to be able to develop their own outlook, their own perspectives on Jupiter topics, like things related to religion, culture, philosophy, the meaning of life, all of these things. Like, they're determined to develop their own perspectives on these. Again, at their best, they can really develop original ideas regarding these topics. So it's important for them to continue asking those questions, because those questions are actually going to be what leads them to keep an open mind and have those breakthroughs that they're searching for. I hope that this video helped you understand the square and the opposition between Mercury and Jupiter in the birth chart. Let me know what your experiences have been with Mercury and Jupiter, if you have any aspects to them, or especially the square or the opposition. And I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.